The Evil Within was an action horror game released back in 2014, directed by the creator of Resident Evil itself, Shinji Mikami. Sadly, while it was a solid game with plenty of memorable moments when it wasn't being scary, it fell far from being a classic thanks to an unreacted protagonist, a poorly told story, and the fact that it just completely shat the bed in its third act when it turned into just an over-the-top action game. However, its sequel tries to address these issues while also changing things up to set itself apart. The Evil Within 2 is an action horror game for PC, Xbox One, and PS4, and it is a substantial improvement over the first one, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have some issues of its own, but thankfully they don't stop it from being a fun horror experience. Hands down, the story has received a lot of attention to assuage fears that would be the same clusterfuck as the first games. Rather than having a mystery that spirals into chaos and total confusion, we get something that's more tightly focused, in particular on Sebastian Castellano's personal turmoil as he searches for his daughter that he thought died in a fire. By default, this makes things so much more cohesive, and as a character, Sebastian is more developed, as he now has emotions other than indifferent determination. This also makes the scarier moments more believable, since a protagonist who's visibly scared or shaken is more likely to sell the atmosphere of a scary scene than a protagonist who always looks like he's waiting for when he can just have his next cigarette. The only real issues the story has is that some of the chapters can either come and go in the blink of an eye while others are at decent length, and that it swaps its villains out halfway through with such an audible clunk, you'll question why you even had to fight the first guy in the first place.
My life was skidding off the track before I went into that place. Being inside Ruvik's head like that, I haven't been the same since.
Combat is more or less that of a standard third-person shooter with stealth elements. It's nothing amazing in of itself, but there is a decent variety of weapons to stop things from getting dull, and it's punctuated with some tremendous sound design, making each gunshot feel like there's an explosive punch behind every time you pull the trigger, and every time you blow an enemy's brains out, it feels like you're splattering a rotten watermelon. The music, though, is forgettable. In fact, now that I think about it, I can't even remember hearing any music. That isn't to say it's not there, but me saying this speaks of how unremarkable the music can be. But getting back to the weapons, there is one that is almost completely useless. The pre-order bonus burst pistol. Unless you want to have a bad time, I would ignore it. It eats through handgun ammo like a fat pig at a buffet, and it's too easy to miss with the fucking thing. Don't use it unless you want the game to be needlessly harder than it really is. In fact, at the core, gameplay as a whole is more or less the same as it was in the first one, but with one major new addition: open world hubs. Practically, this means you have to commute between the story chapters to continue, which could have been a tedious chore, but Evil Within 2 pulls it off beautifully. The hub worlds are just full of enemies that turn the commutes into either a nerve-wracking experience or great opportunities to practice new abilities and tactics that become available. You're also encouraged to explore not only to flesh out the lore of the setting of Union, which really does feel like a decaying world at times, but to pursue certain upgrades, specifically increased ammo on hand, which is a great way to get you poking around and stumbling onto one of the many side stories or secondary missions that adds more meat to the game's length. But with all that being said, don't think this means the game is Skyrim Horror Edition. The majority of the buildings are just giant cereal boxes meant to decorate the area, with only a small handful you can actually explore. And the hub worlds are of modest size, though in the case of size, they do make up for it by at the very least being packed with detail. An aspect of the game that had me rather concerned, though, was that it was being marketed as a play-your-way type of experience, where the horror elements would have been watered down in favour of more action that just gets boring real fast. But I can safely say this: those worries were immediately buried alive and cremated once I started, because this is a pretty scary game. It's no Dark Descent by any stretch of the imagination, but what it is a solid example of action horror done right that isn't Resident Evil 7. It approaches atmosphere and tension with a much slower pace than the original during the more narrative-driven moments, letting you really get into the story and the right mindset to get scared. It's a different story when you're exploring though, thanks to the lack of structure, but thanks to how limited supplies can be, you always need to weigh your actions and consider the consequences. The same can be said about the more action-focused segments, which can be downright tense thanks to the wide variety of enemies who know how to give and take a beating, as well as the aforementioned limited resources. There is also resource crafting and weapon upgrades, but thankfully, like the stat upgrades for Sebastian, they've been balanced so they don't hurt the experience, since the crafting resources are just as scarce as the resources they make, and if you craft in the field, you use up more crafting materials for fewer resources. In the case of the weapon upgrades though, you have to hunt for them and put yourself in the way of danger. When all is said and done, The Evil Within 2 is a great improvement over the first game. While I still wouldn't call it a classic, every issue the first game had has been addressed, and while they haven't been completely fixed, they do make for a much better game. If you're a fan of horror, or just looking for something that's easier to digest than Alien Isolation or Amnesia, then The Evil Within 2 is a dead set must buy.
Lily!
Hey, thanks for watching the video, really appreciate it. If you really enjoyed the video, then don't forget to also like, favorite, and subscribe. And in case of movie reviews, I'm actually going to be taking a brief hiatus from them, just so I can catch up on some of the other ones that, well, I've gotten behind on. I really need to catch up on them, but that's not going to affect game reviews. In fact, for this month, I'm going to be taking a look at the PC version of Destiny 2, and I've got all that and more coming up, got some stuff brewing in my head, so like always, stick around.